Have you ever wondered why the product of two negatives will give a positive number? Well, today we are going to look at this question and we're going to try two different approaches. In the first approach, it's a bit verbal and we're going to look at this idea of a concept of a number. We start out by remembering the number line. If we look at the zero, the position of the zero, it's called the origin. And going to the right, we have our positive numbers. Going to the left of the origin, we have our negative numbers. So if I should ask the question, or should say that I want to move 6 units from the origin, then I could end up at positive 6, or I could end up at negative 6. Now, because these are equal distances from the origin, we will say that the opposite, or negative 6, lies on the opposite side of the origin from 6. So the opposite of positive 6, is negative 6. And likewise, the opposite of negative 6 is 6. That should read is 6. Right, so let's continue a bit. So here is our here's our number line again. Let me put in positive 6, and I'm emphasizing positive, and negative 6 is here. And let's even change the color of our, Right, so I changed the color and we want to look at something else. We want to look at the opposite of 6. So I'm starting at 6, and if I ask what is its opposite, we've gotten to negative 6. But I want now the opposite of 6. So I would like, what is the opposite of minus 6? So starting here, I'm going to the opposite of minus 6. But we have ended up in the same position. So this is where we see that two negatives gives us a positive. We can continue the same idea and say the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 6, which I've written out. I know that the words will seem a bit confusing, but if we write this out symbolically, it's less confusing. What I've started with, and if we see inside the bracket here, this is nothing more than what I have currently. Which side will we end on? So I'm taking the opposite of this term, which will take me back down here, minus 6. Right? And so if I look carefully and compare, this gives me a result of negative 6. So again, what happened was we had two of these negatives coming together and getting a positive. And then the negative times positive is negative 6. And our last, most confusing one, let's look at what we have here. The opposite of, the opposite of, the opposite of, the opposite of 6. So we're looking at 4 negative signs, right? 4 negative signs, which you should write in this way. And we see that it is, let's just move this out of the way. We see that if we should take the opposite, it will take us back onto the positive 6. So what it's telling us is that having an even number of 1, 2, 3, having an even number of negative signs is equal to a positive. Having an odd number is equal to a negative. Right? So I hope this approach will give you an appreciation of why two negatives make a positive. Let's move on to a second approach. Let's simplify a problem where we have lots of negatives. All right, let's see if you could do this. Go ahead, try it. All right, so simplifying this more complicated expression, hopefully you remember that terms are separated by a plus sign or an addition sign. And so what I have to do is recognize what are the numbers that we're dealing with. So there's the opposite or negative of negative 3 or the opposite of 3, but of course it's easier to deal or think about it by using negative, the word negative. And so let's use what we've just learned to simplify. If I have an even number of negative signs, it's simply positive. When I look inside what I've circled here, there's an odd number of negative signs, so overall my number is negative 4. My last term, there are two negative signs, so this is plus 5. I can use my sum of integers, whether you chose to write this as 3 minus 4 plus 5, and using my order of operations, working from left to right, negative 1 plus 5, and so we ended up with a total of 4. So this is how we use the ideas of those negative and negative numbers, or the opposites. Let's move on to another approach, which this approach is using the distributive property. So let's bring up a problem. Now, we could convince ourselves in many ways that 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. I mean, if I should owe you $5, so I owe you $5 on Monday, and I owe you $5 again on Tuesday, then you could say, well, that's 2 times $5. I owe you $10, and the negative sign means 10. But let's look at this from a more formal math way. All right. One of the things that we do know is that if I have minus 5 plus 5, all right, an opposite plus itself, this would be equal to 0. So let's look at putting this in a bracket. Anything I do to one side, I'm going to do to the other. So if I multiply both sides by 2, then of course the right-hand side gives me 0. And if I use the distributive property, most of you will remember this. It is saying if I have, you're combining multiplication and addition. If I'm multiplying, each item inside a bracket is multiplied. And so we ended up with that expansion, if you wish, AB plus AC. So here I have my 2 times negative 5 plus 2 times 5, right? Now, let's say we don't know what this is. We have something plus 10 equal 0. What can that item be? Well, the only thing that I could add to 10 to end up with nothing is a minus 10. So what we have here is 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, or looking at the signs, a positive number times a negative is equal to a negative. So it was now interesting for us to go back to the same question. Why is that we started off here? Why is it that the product of two negatives is a positive? And so I'm going to begin the same way. That is, if I had, say, -2 plus 2, of course, again, we know as any number and its opposite, when I add them, I will end up with 0. So again, let me start off. This time, I'm going to multiply both sides by -5. But one of the properties of 0, when we multiply by 0, the product is 0. Going back through on the left-hand side here, I'm going to use the distributive property. That is, I'm getting rid of those brackets. And I'm showing my steps, something that sometimes our students forget to do. All right, so I have two products. What I have, this is a question mark. We're not sure what -5 times -2 is. However, I do know that -5 times 2 is -10. I just did it over here, right? We just worked on that over here. And so the sum that I have is equal to 0. How can that be? Well, the only thing that we could have here is a +10. +10 plus -10 is 0. So I can conclude that -5 times -2 must be equal to +10. And in that way, we end up seeing a bit more formally in our math than the verbal approach that we used before, that the product of two negatives is a positive. Right? For more videos, you can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/user/themathclinic, or check out our website, or find us on Twitter. We're also on Facebook, so do like us too. And this is Math Clinic and Science Works.